And Jesus modeled for us that if we will actually begin with prayer, if we will listen and eat with someone, what happens is we will discover how we can best serve the person that God or people that God is asking us to bless. Because praying, listening, and eating together ensures that the serving is about the person being served and not the person doing the serving. You know what I mean? The most, I think, profound example we have of Jesus serving is probably on the night before his death. He was with his closest followers before the crucifixion. He knew he was going to be arrested that night, and the next day he'd be put to death. But what he did on that evening in the upper room literally overturned a lie that had plagued humanity since the Garden of Eden. And it's the lie that says, if you want to be blessed, look out for yourself before anybody else. And on that evening, Jesus, you might say, set aside his crown for an apron. The one who sat in the highest position stooped down to serve. And John, Jesus' closest friend and disciple, wrote these words and described that situation this way. He said, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. And I want to back up for just a minute. Kind of a new discovery for me. It says Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, that he'd come from God and was returning to God. And then that word so, he was in a position of power, and therefore he knew he needed to serve. He was in a position of influence, so that is one reason why he chose to serve. And so, God in the flesh, the maker and sustainer of everything, King of kings, Lord of lords. I mean, there's no one higher, no one with more power or authority. Even those in the room who didn't understand his cosmic power or authority would still have seen him as a highly regarded and respected rabbi. And so what Jesus was doing here, we all know, right, was completely scandalous. And it's why Peter responds to Jesus by saying, you shall never wash my feet. And then Jesus says, well, unless I wash you, you'll have no part with me. Peter changes his mind real quick and says, well, then, Lord, just wash all of me. But Peter didn't realize what Jesus was doing, did he? In just a few hours, Jesus would be stripped and humiliated. His crown would again be set aside, this time for a cross. He would take on the full weight of our sin and wash us once and for all with his grace so that we could be clean forever and restored to a right relationship with God. And so Jesus washes feet. He washes feet. And I think what I want to drive home today about this particular blessed practice is this. What you see Jesus did in the upper room the night before his crucifixion was not just a kind gesture. It was intended to actually catalyze a movement. When he finished washing their feet, he says this. He says, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who has sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be what? You'll be blessed, right? All right, there's that word, if you do them. And I think Jesus' message is simple. It's now our turn to serve the way he served. It's your turn to set aside a crown for an apron. And, we live in a world that believes that the higher you rise, the more power and wealth you accumulate, the more leverage you will have to get others to serve you, right? I mean, that's common thought of the day. But Jesus takes that idea, he completely flips it on its head and says, here's what it really looks like to bless the world. You serve. I feel like I'm getting a little preachy here. But let me just ask you. I mean, what would it look like? What would it look like for you to put down your crown and put it on an apron where you live? What would it look like for you to put down a crown and put on an apron where you live? Maybe in your neighborhood, in your apartment or condo building. Or how about this? Maybe this even strikes closer to home. What would it look like for you to put down your crown and put on an apron at home? With your spouse, with your kids, with your roommate. Sometimes it's harder to think about practicing these ways to bless people at home than it is in the neighborhood, but if you're not doing it at home, how much credibility are you really going to have doing it in your neighborhood? Because these everyday ways to love your neighbor and change the world aren't just for somebody, somewhere, right? They can start with the people that you interact with every single day, and sometimes those people might be the very people that live underneath the same roof as you. And when you begin with prayer, you listen and you share meals with people, you're probably gonna have more opportunities to serve than you could ever imagine. And then eventually, what'll happen is you'll begin with prayer, you'll listen, you'll eat, you'll look and take advantage of those opportunities to serve, and then you'll be able to practice the very last one of these, and that's to share your story. To share your story. I'm reminded of Thomas coming to Jesus and asking the question, how can we know the way? And Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, through a relationship with me. And you see, when you befriend and bless people, people will want to know your story. They might even ask, what makes you different? And mean it in a positive way. I mean, why do you do what you do? And then you can tell them your story. Why do you do what you do? What compels you to love and bless the people who come across your path every single day? And then you can tell them that you give the way you give, you love the way you love, and you bless the way you bless because you've been transformed by the love of Jesus. You've been blessed by the ultimate blesser, right? And that's our motivation. That's our story. And how powerful is that? And so I just want to get real practical here in just a few moments and tell you that when you share your story, when you have the opportunity to move towards proclamation, right? To actually share the story, the love of Jesus, I urge you just to keep it simple. I urge you to keep it simple. And I would encourage you to think about crafting your story into 3 parts, all right? This is not anything necessarily profound, but I think it's simple and I think it's important. And part 1 of your story is simply your life before you chose to follow Jesus. Your life before you chose to follow Jesus. What was going on in your life before Jesus took over, before you answered the call of God in your life, before he got a hold of you? I mean, what were you chasing? What were you pursuing in hopes of fulfilling that void that only Jesus can fill? I mean, was it love? Was it relationships? Was it acceptance, a particular purpose, maybe a career, maybe it was money, maybe you had unanswered questions you were seeking answers for. I mean, often it's that searching, I think, for love or purpose or meaning that eventually leads us to Jesus, but that search can also lead us down paths that take us far away from God as well, right? Hopefully they eventually took you to surrendering to the only one who could actually fulfill those longings. And so when you think about crafting your story and taking advantage of the opportunities that God gives you to share your story, first, keep it simple. And the first part is your life before you chose to follow Jesus. Then secondly, the second part then would be how you finally chose to follow Jesus. Share the circumstances surrounding that season or that moment or that time that when you responded to the call of God in your life. I mean, for some people it was dramatic. Maybe you came to a crossroads where you knew if you didn't make a change, then you were headed for destruction, or maybe your life was going to end completely. I mean, for others it was gradual. You had questions that you simply needed answers to. And then others of you, you grew up in a Christian home, Christ-following parents like I did, and I used to sort of, I feel like, well, my story's not particularly powerful. I was sharing with the group at Manor Church last night, but I've talked to enough people now to know that most people who didn't have my experience would trade places with me in a heartbeat. And so I talk about what an impact having a Christ-following family had on my life and how that led to me choosing to follow Jesus too. So share that as well, how you chose to follow Jesus. And then when you're working out your story, think about your life since following Jesus. All right, so it's 3 parts. Your life before, how you chose to follow Jesus, and your life since. And this is where you can share the difference that following Jesus has made in your life. And I would encourage you, it's always important, to be honest, be authentic, be real, share the good stuff, share the hard stuff, everything in between. And I know some of you, there's a tendency maybe to feel uncomfortable telling your story or sharing it. And I get that. You might get nervous. You might stumble over your words, but it's really okay. It's your story. And I think, if I could just kind of maybe poke you just a little bit, are you gonna really let your nervousness or your hesitancy get in the way of maybe somebody experiencing the difference that Christ could make in their life? Barna research tells us that 3 out of 4 adults say they want to grow spiritually. 3 out of 4. That's not Christians. That's just generally 3 out of 4 adults say they want to grow spiritually. People are longing for something more. They're looking for answers to their questions. They're wanting to find purpose and hope in this life. Nearly half of adults say they are more open to God today than they were before COVID, before the pandemic. Nearly half of adults say they are more open to God now than they were before the pandemic. John, Jesus' close friend and follower, shares how a blind man was miraculously healed by Jesus. You're familiar with the story, I'm sure. And just after he's healed, he very simply shares his story, and he says what? I was blind, but now I see. All right, I was blind, but now I see. I love how simple it is. He didn't try to quote scripture or articulate theology necessarily. He didn't pull out a Post-it note and draw a diagram. He simply shared his story. I was blind, and now I see. I was blind. That's who this man was before he met Jesus, right? He was blind. Then he would have to say, well, Jesus put mud on my eyes. And that's probably how he'd explain the strange encounter that he had with Jesus. And it is strange, right? But, nobody can debate his experience. That's how he met Jesus. And your story, how you encountered Jesus, it may sound strange too, but guess what? It is your story. And who can debate your story? And then he would likely say, yeah, I was blind, but now I see. Now I see. And that's how this man would explain the difference that Jesus has made in his life. But if you think about that, isn't that your story? In a lot of ways, isn't that my story? I mean, I was blind to, how my sin put distance between me and the only one who could rescue me. But now I see, right? Now you see. I see his grace and his love and his forgiveness and how that helps me see a future that I never even knew was possible. So we begin with prayer. We listen. We eat, we share meals together, we serve, because when we begin with prayer, when we listen, when we share meals, we're going to discover real and practical and authentic ways that we can serve people, and it ensures that the serving is about the people being served and not just me getting a good feeling from serving. And then when you have the opportunity, you share the gospel story. You share what the love of Christ has done for us. And when you do it, it's going to be powerful, it's going to be life-changing, and it's going to make a difference. All right, so we're going to take some time to talk about what this looks like in our discussion groups as we have now gone through B.L.E.S.S. In this next session, I'm going to talk about what it looks like to begin to think about how you can take what you're learning and create a culture of blessing in your churches.